It was a bright, ordinary afternoon in a quiet town. The streets were calm, the sun spilling warmth over parked cars and sidewalks lined with trees. Families walked by, people were chatting, and the local supermarket was buzzing with life. Inside, the air was filled with the mixed scent of fresh bread, fruits, and cleaning products. Customers moved through aisles, picking up groceries, baskets clinking as they went. For most, it was just another ordinary day. A simple routine of buying essentials, nothing out of the ordinary. But for one woman, a highly respected senior officer in the Army, this ordinary day was about to turn into a moment she would never forget. She had planned this trip carefully, a brief stop to grab a few things before heading home. Her days were usually packed with responsibilities, meetings, training sessions, and community work. But she always found time for simple errands like this. Today she wore a plain shirt and casual pants, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Her uniform and medals, which she usually wore with pride, were tucked away at home. She wanted to blend in, to move unnoticed, just like any other person in the store. She walked with calm confidence, scanning the aisles, making a mental list of what she needed. The supermarket was busier than she expected. Shoppers were everywhere, pushing carts, reaching for items on shelves, and trying to navigate narrow aisles. The sound of chatter mixed with the beep of scanning machines at the checkout counters. There was a child laughing in the distance, an elderly man carefully inspecting vegetables, a couple debating which cereal to choose. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. She stopped near the section with canned goods, picking up a few cans and examining them. She moved through the aisle slowly, taking her time, ensuring she didn't forget anything. Meanwhile, another person was in the store. A police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, was walking the aisles on what should have been a routine patrol. From the moment he entered, there was a tension in his demeanor. He moved with a sense of authority, scanning the crowd, eyes darting back and forth. His uniform was neat, his badge shiny, but his face carried a hard expression, one that seemed to expect trouble. For reasons that had nothing to do with the day's events, he was already on edge. Perhaps it was frustration from earlier calls, or a sense of superiority, or just a bad mood, but it made him ready to see threat where there was none. As the Army officer reached for a can on the top shelf, he noticed her. At first glance, she was just another shopper, but something about her caught his attention. He slowed his pace, eyes narrowing, his mind starting to construct a story about her that had no connection to reality. He watched her carefully, noting how she moved, how she looked around. He didn't know who she was, didn't know her rank, her service, or her life story. Yet in his mind, he made assumptions. He started to feel suspicion, a sense of imagined danger that had no foundation. The Army officer was completely unaware of his gaze. She picked up a few more items, placing them in her basket, unaware that a storm was quietly brewing in her direction. Her mind was focused on simple, everyday tasks, making sure she had enough milk, checking dates on packages, thinking about dinner she would prepare later. She had no reason to suspect that anyone would target her. She was polite, careful, and calm, the type of person who naturally radiates composure. To most, she was invisible in the crowd, just another customer moving through a busy store. But the officer continued to follow, keeping a certain distance but never letting her out of his sight. He seemed to be deciding in his own mind whether she was suspicious, whether she should be confronted. Every step she took was being watched, every small movement analyzed, twisted into a story of imagined wrongdoing. It was a tense contrast, the calm, methodical shopping of a professional who had spent decades in service versus the biased, aggressive assumptions of a man who had no real reason to act. Other shoppers continued their routines, unaware of the tension growing nearby. A young woman glanced at a shelf, humming to herself. A man pushed his cart past the aisle, adjusting his hat. A child tugged at their parent's hand, pointing at a colorful display. None of them knew that right next to them, a confrontation was quietly developing, one that would soon shatter the normalcy of the day. As she moved to the next aisle, reaching for bread and some dairy products, the officer began to approach. His movements were deliberate, calculated, yet somehow rushed, like someone ready to act before thinking. His hand hovered near his belt, near his service weapon, and he muttered under his breath, though no one else could hear. The tension in his body was clear to anyone who looked closely. He was ready to escalate a situation that didn't exist. The Army officer paused, noticing a small spill near the end of the aisle. She bent slightly to grab a paper towel from the nearby shelf, her attention entirely on the task. She didn't notice the officer moving closer, didn't sense the growing danger. She had faced difficult and dangerous situations before in her career, but this felt different, because she had no clue this threat was coming from someone meant to uphold the law, someone standing right behind her, watching and judging without reason. Her movements were careful, controlled, precise. She handled the items in her basket with efficiency, placing heavier items at the bottom, lighter ones on top. She checked dates, looked for freshness, occasionally glancing down the aisle to see if there was anything she might need. She was meticulous, organized, aware of her surroundings, yet entirely unsuspecting of the looming confrontation. Her focus was on simple human tasks, the small and often overlooked details of life that keep daily routines moving smoothly. Meanwhile, the officer's internal tension was building. His thoughts were clouded by bias, by impatience, by a sense of imagined threat. Every simple action she took was being interpreted incorrectly. Her calm and deliberate movements, normal to any person, were twisted in his mind into signs of something dangerous or suspicious. The air between them, invisible to everyone else, was charged. It was like standing near a live wire, unaware that a storm could strike at any second. Other shoppers were slowly starting to notice the tension. A few glanced over, sensing a subtle discomfort, a stiffness in the air, but they couldn't see exactly what was happening. They only felt a faint unease, a ripple of tension passing through the ordinary chatter of the supermarket. Life continued around them. Carts rolled, children laughed. Announcements played over the loudspeaker. But the quiet focus of the army officer and the officer's biased scrutiny created a small, intense bubble of danger. She moved toward the checkout, pushing her basket gently in front of her. Her steps were calm, deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. Her mind was entirely occupied with her shopping list, with remembering what she had forgotten last time, with planning her evening. Her world was simple, organized, peaceful. She had no idea that a potentially life-altering encounter was developing mere feet behind her. The officer finally closed the distance. His face was set, his posture stiff. He was ready to act, to confront, to escalate a situation that should never have existed. His hand moved subtly near his belt, fingers brushing against his service weapon. He thought he was in control, that he was about to assert authority, when in fact he was about to create chaos. The calm, ordinary day of the supermarket, filled with simple human interactions, was about to be shattered by fear, prejudice, and misuse of power. At that moment, the army officer remained unaware. She picked up a few small items near the end of the aisle, inspecting them, placing them carefully into her basket. Her movements were normal, human, the kind that everyone does without thinking. Yet in the eyes of the officer, they were suspicious. The ordinary act of shopping, of taking time to examine goods, had become a catalyst for confrontation. Time seemed to stretch. The ordinary sounds of the supermarket, the beeping of checkout scanners, the chatter of people, the rustle of packaging, were all drowned out in the officer's mind by a single, distorted focus. He was ready to act, and she, calm and composed, moved unknowingly into the center of a storm she had no way to anticipate. And so, the ordinary day, filled with sunlight, laughter, and the quiet routines of daily life, teetered on the edge of an extraordinary event. A simple shopping trip had unknowingly brought together two people whose worlds should never have collided in this way. One carried years of service, professionalism, and calm. The other carried bias, aggression, and fear disguised as authority. The first part of this story ends here in a moment of quiet tension, with shoppers unaware of the drama about to unfold, with the stage set for a confrontation that would quickly ripple far beyond the walls of the supermarket. The moment that followed seemed a stretch, even though it lasted only seconds. The army officer had finished picking up a few items, and she turned to move toward the checkout aisle. The officer, who had been following her, slowly closed the distance. His steps were deliberate, his face hard, as if he had convinced himself that she posed some kind of threat. In reality, she had done nothing at all. She was calm, her movement steady, as she pushed her basket carefully along the aisle. The officer stopped just a few feet behind her. His eyes narrowed, and a sense of tension radiated from him. He reached toward his belt, his hand brushing the edge of his service weapon. For anyone watching, it would have been impossible to tell why he was doing this. There was no commotion, no visible sign of danger, just a woman quietly shopping. Yet in his mind, a story had already been written. a story that cast her as suspicious, even dangerous. The army officer felt a subtle shift in the air. Something was off. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was the kind of feeling that comes when someone watches you too closely, when a presence is heavier than it should be. She glanced slightly over her shoulder, noticing the officer standing there. Her expression remained calm, though a quiet alertness settled over her. She had faced tense situations before, though never like this in a supermarket surrounded by ordinary people going about their day. The officer's voice broke the quiet hum of the store. It was sharp, demanding, almost panicked. He accused her of suspicious behavior, asking why she was in the store, why she was moving around the aisles. His words were harsh, quick, and laced with authority, but also with something else, a bias that made him certain he was in the right. Shoppers nearby paused, glancing toward the commotion. Some whispered to each other. Others continued their shopping, unsure whether to get involved. The army officer responded with calm, steady words. She introduced herself carefully, maintaining a composed tone. She asked why he was confronting her, calmly explaining that she was merely shopping and that there was no reason for suspicion. Her voice was firm but controlled, projecting authority without aggression. She did not raise her voice, did not panic, even though the situation was tense and could have escalated in an instant. Instead of listening, the officer took a further step, reaching toward his weapon. The movement was sudden, alarming, and visible to everyone in the aisle. Panic rippled quietly through nearby shoppers. A mother pulled her child close, a man froze mid-step, and a few people started recording on their phones, sensing that something serious was happening. The officer's hand rested near his service gun as he pointed it directly at the army officer. The gesture, unnecessary and reckless, turned a normal shopping trip into a moment of fear and tension. The army officer's reaction was measured. She did not flinch, did not make sudden moves. Years of training and experience had taught her to remain calm in moments of danger. She kept her hands visible, slowly raising them to show she posed no threat. Her eyes met his steadily, holding a gaze that was firm and unwavering. She spoke, her tone clear, asking him to lower the weapon, to follow proper protocol. Every word she said carried authority, but it was calm, designed to de-escalate, not to provoke. Shoppers around them began whispering among themselves. Some called for help from the store staff. Others simply watched, unsure what would happen next. The atmosphere in the aisle shifted from casual to tense, filled with unspoken fear and anticipation. The air felt thick, as though it was holding its breath along with the people inside. Cameras on phones recorded every second, capturing what many would later describe as shocking behavior from a law enforcement officer. The officer pointed his weapon more firmly, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to maintain control. His mind raced, but not with clarity, rather with panic, prejudice, and a distorted sense of authority. He made accusations, speaking over the army officer's calm instructions, insisting she comply immediately. The situation had become dangerous not because of her, but because of his decisions and his inability to assess the reality of the situation. Despite the threat of the weapon, the army officer remained composed. She spoke slowly, clearly, reminding him that she was a senior officer in the army. She stated her rank and position, hoping to convey her authority and to remind him that his behavior was inappropriate. The words seemed to hit him like a shock. His face went pale, his confidence shaken as he realized the person he was confronting was not a regular shopper, not someone without influence, but a highly respected officer. At that moment, the dynamic shifted slightly. The officer's aggression faltered, replaced by hesitation. He glanced around, aware that other shoppers were now fully observing him, that phones were recording, that witnesses were present who could testify to everything. For a moment he realized that this situation was not under his control, that the consequences of his actions could be severe. But the fear, pride, and prejudice that had driven him this far did not disappear immediately. The army officer continued speaking, her voice calm but firm. She instructed him to follow protocol, to lower his weapon, and to resolve the situation professionally. She did not shout, she did not threaten, she did not panic. Her body language remained open, her hands raised slightly but steadily, showing compliance while subtly asserting authority. It was a display of controlled power, of someone who knew exactly how to handle an escalating situation without making it worse. Nearby shoppers began to react more clearly. Some moved back slightly, giving space. Others whispered, "What is going on?" Or, "Why is he pointing that at her?" The tension in the air grew, but so did awareness. More people began recording, capturing a moment that would later spread online, highlighting an incident that nobody would forget. The Army officer's composure was contrasted sharply against the reckless actions of the officer, emphasizing the clear imbalance of judgment and behavior. The officer's voice wavered slightly as he tried to justify his actions. He muttered about suspicion, about rules, about imagined threats, but his words sounded hollow in the presence of the calm, professional response from the Army officer. It was clear to anyone observing that his actions were fueled not by fact, but by bias, impatience, and a distorted sense of authority. His mistake was becoming increasingly obvious even to him, though admitting it would not come easily. As seconds ticked by, the Army officer began subtly guiding the situation toward resolution. She kept speaking, calm and steady, repeating her instructions clearly. She reminded him that pointing a weapon at someone without reason was dangerous, unlawful, and could have serious consequences. She emphasized safety, protocol, and responsibility, using every word to de-escalate the moment. Her professionalism contrasted sharply with the officer's rash behavior, highlighting the seriousness of what was unfolding. Finally, the officer lowered his weapon slightly, though not completely. He seemed unsure, caught between fear, pride, and realization. The Army officer maintained her calm, her tone unchanged, and continued to assert control over the situation through words, not aggression. She made it clear that she was not a threat, that she had done nothing wrong, and that his behavior was unacceptable. The presence of witnesses and recording devices amplified the pressure, making it clear that accountability was immediate. The aisle was now completely focused on them. Shoppers had paused their errands. Store staff were watching closely, and cameras on phones were actively recording. The atmosphere was electric with tension, and yet there was a strange sense of admiration for the Army officer. People began noticing her calmness, her ability to handle the situation with composure and authority. Every movement she made reinforced that she was in control, even though the officer had drawn a weapon. After a long, tense pause, the officer finally took a step back. His hand lingered near the weapon, but the threat had diminished. He seemed to recognize, perhaps for the first time fully, that his assumptions were wrong, that his actions were reckless, and that he could face serious consequences for what he had done. His face showed a mix of fear, shame, and disbelief, as though the reality of the moment was sinking in, and he had no clear way to recover. The Army officer, still calm, instructed him to continue stepping back and to follow proper procedure. She reminded him that safety and professionalism were essential, and that further escalation would only make the situation worse. Her tone was firm, patient, and commanding, not just as a senior officer, but as someone who understood authority, responsibility, and human behavior. Every word was measured, intended to de-escalate and resolve without unnecessary conflict. Witnesses slowly began to relax, sensing that the situation was moving toward resolution. The mother with the child moved slightly closer, curious but relieved. Shoppers whispered to each other, commenting on the bravery and professionalism of the Army officer. Phones continued recording, capturing every detail that could later serve as evidence. The tension remained, but it was no longer at its peak. The moment of crisis was passing, and the reality of the officer's reckless actions was becoming undeniable. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only a few minutes, the officer fully lowered his weapon. His body slumped slightly, a mixture of relief and shame crossing his face. The Army officer remained steady, her composure unshaken.
"Shiek no?"
The supermarket aisle was quiet now, though not completely. The shoppers around them had slowed their movements, glancing with curiosity and concern at the scene that had just unfolded. Some whispered to each other, exchanging questions and astonished expressions, while others remained still, their phones recording the incident. What had begun as an ordinary shopping trip had transformed into something unforgettable, a confrontation that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. The Army officer stood calmly, her posture steady, her eyes attentive. She was aware of every small movement of the police officer in front of her, aware of the shoppers who had witnessed the event, and aware of the ripple effect her calm had already caused. The officer before her was no longer aggressive in the same way he had been moments ago, but he was tense, hesitant, and clearly shaken. The gravity of the moment was starting to sink in, though perhaps only partially. He had just realized that the person he had threatened was no ordinary civilian. She was a senior Army officer, someone with authority, training, and recognition, who had devoted her life to service and discipline. The contrast between her composure and his reckless actions made his mistake glaringly obvious. He looked around, noticing the people recording, the whispers of bystanders, and the security cameras that undoubtedly captured every detail. It became clear that this was no private confrontation. It was an incident that could have serious consequences, both professionally and publicly. The Army officer spoke again, her voice steady and calm. She introduced herself fully, stating her rank and position. She explained that her experience and training allowed her to remain composed even in tense situations, and she reminded the officer that pointing a weapon without reason was unacceptable. Every word she spoke carried authority, but not anger. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell. She did not insult. She was firm, clear, and professional, using reason and clarity to assert control over the situation. For the officer, it was like a sudden wake-up call. His hand, which had hovered near his weapon, began to lower slowly as he struggled to process what had just occurred. His mind raced with conflicting emotions: fear, embarrassment, shame, and disbelief. He had acted on impulse, influenced by bias and unfounded suspicion, and now the consequences of his behavior were staring him in the face. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his actions were not only unprofessional, but could also cost him his job and reputation. Witnesses began speaking up, adding weight to the situation. A store employee approached carefully, asking if everyone was okay and trying to understand what had happened. Shoppers murmured about what they had seen, describing how the officer had drawn his weapon without cause. Their accounts, combined with the recordings from phones and the store's security cameras, created a clear and undeniable record. The officer's actions were no longer just a personal mistake. They were a public display of misconduct. The Army officer continued to speak, emphasizing safety, responsibility, and accountability. She reminded him that authority came with the responsibility to act fairly and justly, and that bias and assumption had no place in enforcement or leadership. Her words were not confrontational, but they carried a weight that could not be ignored. She made it clear that this was not just a lesson in humility. It was a moment that highlighted the importance of discipline, self-control, and respect for others. The officer tried to explain himself, stammering as he searched for justification. He mentioned suspicion, routine checks, and the stress of the day, but his words sounded weak even to him. The calm authority of the Army officer and the presence of witnesses made it clear that excuses would not erase the severity of his actions. The gap between their composure and judgment was striking. She remained unshaken, composed, and professional, while he struggled to regain control over the situation he had created. As the realization of his mistake grew, so did his panic. He looked around the aisle, noticing more people recording, more cameras pointing in his direction, and more witnesses silently observing. He understood that this incident would not stay contained. It would spread, become a matter for the department, for public discussion, and for scrutiny from those he had once assumed he could intimidate. The awareness of accountability, immediate and unavoidable, settled heavily on his shoulders. The Army officer spoke again, giving him precise instructions on how to correct his behavior immediately. She requested that he follow proper protocol, report the incident, and explain his actions to his superiors. Her tone remained calm, controlled, and authoritative, but it left no room for misunderstanding. Every word reinforced the importance of professionalism and the necessity of acknowledging mistakes rather than allowing them to escalate further. The officer's face reflected shame and fear. He realized that he had not only endangered someone, but had also embarrassed himself and compromised the integrity of the law enforcement profession. The stark contrast between his reckless behavior and her composed, controlled presence highlighted his failure. The bystanders' reactions made it even clearer. People were observing, recording, and forming opinions about what they had witnessed. There was no way to hide from the truth of his actions. Meanwhile, the Army officer maintained her calm. She was aware that escalation could still occur if he panicked or resisted. She kept her movements measured, her tone clear, and her body language neutral but firm. Every gesture was designed to de-escalate, to assert control without confrontation, and to protect herself and others around her. She understood the psychology of fear and authority, and she applied that knowledge with precision in this high-stakes moment. The officer attempted to step back, but his movements were jerky and hesitant. The Army officer instructed him on how to lower his weapon completely, explaining the importance of doing so immediately and safely. She spoke without anger, without judgment, but with undeniable authority. Each word emphasized safety, procedure, and respect, and it became clear to everyone present that she was guiding the situation with experience and calm reasoning. The bystanders' attention was fully captured. They watched quietly, some whispering to each other, some visibly relieved as the weapon was slowly lowered. They had witnessed a dangerous situation that could have ended badly, but the Army officer's calm professionalism had prevented further escalation. Many later reflected on how remarkable it was that she had maintained composure under such intense pressure. She had turned a potentially tragic encounter into a controlled, teachable moment. Once the weapon was fully lowered, the Army officer spoke about responsibility and accountability. She reminded the officer that actions have consequences and that authority without discipline can cause harm. Her words were firm, insightful, and delivered with clarity. She emphasized that the safety of civilians, including herself, was paramount, and that such reckless behavior could never be repeated. Her speech was measured and deliberate, ensuring the lesson was clear without creating unnecessary conflict. The officer now fully realized the magnitude of his mistake. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, and his posture slumped. He understood that his career, reputation, and future could be in jeopardy because of a single moment of poor judgment. He looked at the Army officer with a mix of fear, regret, and helplessness. She met his gaze steadily, unflinching, projecting authority, confidence, and calm, qualities that highlighted the difference between responsible service and reckless behavior. The bystanders, sensing that the immediate danger had passed, began to move cautiously. Some approached to speak quietly with the Army officer, asking if she was okay. Others spoke to store staff, ensuring that security protocols were followed. The atmosphere remained tense, but there was a sense that the situation was under control. The Army officer's composure had prevented chaos, and her steady guidance had allowed for the officer to begin acknowledging his errors. The officer finally spoke, admitting that he had overreacted, that his actions were wrong, and that he had acted without reason. His words were awkward, but they marked the first step toward accountability. The Army officer listened carefully, acknowledging his admission but making it clear that it was not enough to simply apologize. There needed to be formal accountability, review, and consequences for the reckless actions he had taken. Security staff arrived, observing the situation and reviewing footage from the cameras. They confirmed the sequence of events, noting the Army officer's calm response and the officer's unprovoked actions. Witnesses' statements were collected and the recordings from phones were secured. It became clear that this incident would not be forgotten, and that it would likely lead to a formal investigation and potential consequences for the officer's misconduct. The Army officer continued to guide the situation carefully. She emphasized that while the immediate danger had passed, the lessons from the incident must be carried forward. She explained the importance of maintaining composure, understanding authority, and never allowing bias or assumption to dictate actions. Her words were calm, measured, and full of insight, offering guidance not only to the officer but to everyone observing. By the time the incident concluded, it was clear that the Army officer had turned a potentially catastrophic event into a controlled, instructive moment. The supermarket had returned to a quiet rhythm, but the tension in the aisle lingered like a shadow. Shoppers who had initially gone about their errands cautiously now stood frozen, their eyes glued to the unfolding scene. Phones were out, recording silently, capturing a moment none of them would ever forget. The Army officer remained calm, her composure unwavering, a pillar of steadiness in a situation that had started spiraling out of control. The officer who had drawn his weapon now seemed to realize, even if only partially, the seriousness of his actions. He took a step back, his hand still brushing against the holster, a slight tremor in his fingers betraying the conflict within him. Fear, shame, and embarrassment flickered across his face. He had acted without reason, guided by bias and misplaced authority, and now the consequences were pressing down on him from all directions. The army officer spoke again, her voice measured and clear, cutting through the tension in the aisle. She reminded him to follow proper procedures, to understand the responsibility that came with holding a weapon, and to think before acting. Her words were calm but firm, not accusatory, not angry, yet they carried undeniable authority. She was teaching a lesson in accountability without raising her voice or escalating the situation. The officer stammered, searching for justification, muttering about suspicion and the stress of his day, but his words sounded hollow even to him. He realized that any excuses he offered could not erase the clear evidence of his behavior, the weapon he had pointed unnecessarily, the fear he had caused, and the witnesses who had seen everything unfold. His mind raced, trying to find a way to recover, to explain away the obvious mistake he had made, but the army officer's calm authority made it clear that excuses would not suffice. Around them, the shoppers began to take notice in different ways. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering reassurances, her eyes wide with concern. A man paused mid-step, clutching his shopping basket tightly, realizing how easily an ordinary day could become dangerous. Others whispered to one another, speculating about what had caused the confrontation, the seriousness of pointing a weapon at a civilian, and the courage of the woman standing firm in the face of aggression. The army officer's focus never wavered. She understood that escalation could still occur if he panicked, so she maintained a neutral posture, keeping her hands visible and her movements slow and deliberate. Every gesture was calculated to convey calm authority, while preventing sudden movements that could reignite tension. She knew the power of human presence, the ability to influence others through calmness and clarity. Her entire demeanor reflected years of training, experience, and discipline. The officer's face gradually shifted from anger and aggression to confusion and fear. He began to recognize that he was in the wrong, that his assumptions had been baseless, and that his actions had been reckless. The presence of witnesses and the army officer's clear, composed response made it impossible for him to ignore the reality of the situation. His confidence, which had initially driven him to confront her, was now replaced by shame and uncertainty. The army officer continued to speak calmly, reinforcing the importance of safety and protocol. She explained that holding a weapon without reason endangered lives and violated fundamental principles of law enforcement. She emphasized that authority was not just about power, but about responsibility, judgment, and respect for others. Her words were deliberate, instructive, and grounded in professionalism, creating a contrast with the reckless behavior she had just endured. Nearby shoppers watched with a mixture of relief and admiration. Some spoke quietly to each other, marveling at her composure, while others continued to record the incident, knowing that it was something important that needed to be documented. The army officer's calm, professional demeanor had shifted the mood of the entire aisle, transforming fear into a quiet sense of respect for her ability to manage a dangerous encounter. The officer began to step back, lowering his hand from the weapon completely. His body language now revealed defeat, a recognition that he had crossed a line that could not be undone. He was no longer aggressive. Instead, he appeared vulnerable, aware that witnesses could see the full extent of his mistake. His eyes darted around, observing the recording devices, the people watching, and the store staff who were now fully alert to the situation. The army officer spoke again, guiding him through the immediate steps to de-escalate fully. She instructed him to follow procedure, report the incident to his superiors, and acknowledge his misconduct. Her words were calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. She understood that in such moments, clarity and authority were more powerful than anger. Her voice, steady and composed, carried the weight of experience and professional discipline, making it clear that she was in control. Witnesses began to provide details to store staff, explaining what had happened. Phones continued recording as shoppers shared their perspectives on the officer's reckless behavior. The army officer's presence had not only diffused the immediate danger, but had also ensured that accountability was inevitable. Her calmness had created a space where truth and responsibility could take precedence over bias and aggression. The officer, now fully aware of the implications of his actions, tried to explain himself further. He spoke about routine checks, about suspicion, and about stress. But his explanations sounded weak and insufficient in the face of clear evidence and the Army officer's unwavering authority. The contrast between his rash, fear-driven behavior and her composed, deliberate actions was stark, highlighting how recklessness and bias could be exposed when faced with calm professionalism. The Army officer maintained a measured tone, acknowledging his statements but emphasizing that they did not excuse his behavior. She reminded him that accountability was necessary, that safety and responsibility were paramount, and that this moment would have consequences beyond the immediate encounter. She spoke not to punish but to guide, to ensure that he understood the gravity of his mistake and the importance of never repeating such behavior. The officer's body language revealed growing discomfort. His shoulders slumped, his gaze lowered, and his hands fidgeted nervously. He began to grasp that this incident would follow him, potentially affecting his career, his reputation, and his standing within the community. The Army officer's calm authority had made it clear that recklessness and bias could not hide in plain sight, and that public scrutiny, combined with professional standards, demanded accountability. The atmosphere in the aisle was tense but controlled. Shoppers observed quietly, some whispering about the courage of the Army officer, others speculating about the repercussions for the officer who had acted recklessly. The situation had transformed from a moment of fear into a scene of instruction, where calm professionalism was setting an example for everyone present. The Army officer's actions had turned a potentially dangerous encounter into a learning moment about responsibility, authority, and respect. The officer finally took a step back, lowering his weapon fully, his movements hesitant but deliberate. The Army officer continued to speak, reinforcing the importance of following protocol, reporting the incident, and reflecting on his actions. Her tone was calm, measured, and authoritative, demonstrating that leadership was not about aggression, but about clarity, composure, and responsibility. Security staff and store employees were now fully engaged, observing the situation, reviewing footage, and ensuring that everyone remained safe. Witnesses continued to provide statements, capturing the details of the incident for documentation. The Army officer's professionalism had turned the event into a teachable moment, highlighting how calm, reasoned responses could prevent escalation and ensure accountability. The officer spoke again, admitting that he had overreacted and that his actions were wrong. His words were awkward, hesitant, but they were the first step toward acknowledging the full extent of his misconduct. The Army officer listened carefully, maintaining composure while emphasizing that acknowledgement alone was not enough. There needed to be formal review and consequences, ensuring that safety, responsibility, and professional standards were upheld. Shoppers began to return to their routines, though the air remained charged with awareness. Conversations whispered through the aisles, reflecting on the incident and the bravery of the Army officer. People discussed how quickly ordinary moments could turn dangerous, and how composure and professionalism could prevent tragedy. The Army officer's presence had not only protected herself, but it also educated everyone present about responsibility, authority, and calm leadership. By the time the incident concluded, it was clear that the Army officer had turned a potentially dangerous confrontation into a controlled, instructive moment. The officer had begun to recognize the magnitude of his mistake. Witnesses had recorded and observed the incident, and the importance of accountability had been reinforced. The ordinary supermarket aisle had become a stage for a powerful demonstration of courage, discipline, and responsibility. The Army officer remained composed throughout, guiding the officer through acknowledgement and de-escalation. Her steady presence emphasized that leadership and authority are about clarity, patience, and measured action, not fear or bias. The officer, now fully aware of his amir. The formal investigation began the day after the incident, but the effects of what had happened in the supermarket lingered everywhere. News of the confrontation had spread quickly, first among colleagues, then through the department, and finally among the community. The officer who had drawn his weapon felt the weight of scrutiny pressing down from all sides. Every detail of his actions was being examined, every decision questioned, and every justification challenged. He had spent the night replaying the incident in his mind, unable to sleep. The memory of the Army officer's calm eyes and steady voice haunted him. He could see the witnesses recording, hear the whispers of the shoppers, and feel the realization of his mistake in every nerve. For the first time in years, he felt the full gravity of his actions. His authority, which he had once relied upon as unquestionable, now seemed fragile and unreliable. At the police department, his colleagues began gathering statements and reviewing the footage from the supermarket. The evidence was clear and undeniable. The recordings showed him approaching without cause, drawing his weapon unnecessarily and escalating a situation that had required no intervention. The Army officer's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with his recklessness, making it obvious who had acted responsibly and who had acted impulsively. The department officials called him in for questioning. He arrived tense, unsure of how to respond. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the weight of his mistake was physically pressing down on him. He tried to prepare explanations, rehearsing words about routine checks and suspicion, but he knew deep down that nothing could justify what he had done. The calm professionalism of the Army officer had exposed the weakness in his judgment and the prejudice behind his actions. During the questioning, the Army officer's recorded statement played a critical role. Her account was precise, clear, and factual, leaving no room for misunderstanding. She described the officer's actions without exaggeration, but with an emphasis on the recklessness and potential danger they had caused. Her calm, authoritative voice carried weight in the room, influencing the investigators and making it clear that accountability was necessary. The officer who had drawn his weapon struggled to respond. His explanations faltered. His words seemed hollow, and his previous confidence had completely vanished. He realized that his behavior had endangered someone without cause, and that the consequences would not be minor. The department was obligated to act decisively, both for the sake of the officer's accountability and for public trust in law enforcement. Community reactions added another layer of pressure. The recordings from the supermarket had spread online, with viewers expressing shock and concern. Social media comments highlighted the courage of the Army officer and criticized the reckless actions of the police officer. Local news outlets picked up the story, further increasing the visibility of the incident. The officer now faced public scrutiny alongside formal departmental investigation, and he understood that his actions had created a situation he could no longer control. As the investigation proceeded, the officer was placed on administrative leave. It was a precautionary measure, but it also sent a clear message. His behavior was under serious review, and the department was taking the incident seriously. This time away from duty allowed investigators to conduct interviews, review evidence, and determine appropriate disciplinary measures. It also gave the officer time to reflect on the full consequences of his actions, though reflection did little to ease his growing anxiety. The Army officer continued to provide her account, answering questions and clarifying details. Her calm, professional demeanor remained consistent, and she emphasized the importance of accountability and the proper use of authority. Her testimony reinforced the lessons from the incident, the need for discipline, the dangers of bias, and the impact of reckless behavior. Her presence in the investigation underscored the contrast between responsible authority and misuse of power. Witnesses were interviewed, and the recordings were analyzed carefully. Each statement reinforced the same narrative. The officer had acted recklessly, the Army officer had maintained composure and authority, and the potential for harm had been serious. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving investigators with little doubt about the need for action. The officer's defense, based on routine checks and suspicion, was clearly insufficient. The officer began to realize the severity of the consequences. The investigation was not just a review. It was a judgment of character, professionalism, and judgment under pressure. His career, reputation, and future were all at stake. The calm authority of the Army officer had highlighted his flaws, and the public scrutiny added a new dimension of accountability. He understood that any attempt to minimize or dismiss his behavior would be futile. Throughout this process, the Army officer remained professional and composed. She did not seek to punish the officer personally. Her focus was on ensuring safety, accountability, and the proper functioning of the law enforcement system. Her approach demonstrated that true authority is exercised with discipline, fairness, and clarity, rather than aggression or bias. Her conduct became a model of responsible leadership. The department eventually made a decision based on the evidence, statements, and recordings. The officer was formally reprimanded, relieved of his duties, and removed from active service. The decision was not taken lightly, but it was necessary to maintain the integrity of the force and to restore public trust. The consequences reflected the seriousness of his actions and the need to uphold professional standards. The public response was immediate. Community members expressed support for the Army officer, praising her calm and professional handling of a dangerous situation. Many highlighted the importance of holding law enforcement accountable, emphasizing that no one is above the law and that reckless behavior has consequences. The story became a reference point in discussions about professionalism, bias, and responsibility in positions of authority. The officer faced not only professional consequences, but personal reflection. The incident had left a lasting impression on him. He realized how quickly assumptions, bias, and unchecked authority could escalate into dangerous situations. He understood the importance of composure, respect, and careful judgment. The memory of the Army officer's calm presence served as a stark reminder of the standards he had failed to uphold. Meanwhile, the Army officer returned to her regular duties, her reputation strengthened by the incident. She had demonstrated courage, professionalism, and authority in a real-world situation that could have ended tragically. Her actions became a model for others in law enforcement and the military, showing how calm, clear-headed responses can prevent escalation and ensure accountability. Shoppers and witnesses continued to discuss the incident, reflecting on the lessons learned. They highlighted the importance of staying calm under pressure, the value of professionalism, and the dangers of bias in positions of authority. The story circulated widely, reminding the community of the potential consequences when authority is misused and the importance of holding individuals accountable for their actions. The officer, who had acted recklessly, now faced the challenge of rebuilding his life and reputation. The removal from duty was a clear statement that unprofessional behavior would not be tolerated, and he had to confront the consequences of his actions honestly. The lessons from the incident would follow him for years, serving as a reminder of the importance of discipline, accountability, and the responsible use of authority. The Army officer's response had a lasting impact beyond the immediate incident. Her calm and professional handling of the confrontation inspired others, demonstrating that true authority is exercised through discipline, composure, and fairness. The contrast between her conduct and the reckless behavior of the officer highlighted the importance of responsibility in positions of power. In the end, the supermarket incident became more than just a local story. It was a lesson in human behavior, professionalism, and accountability. It reminded people that bias, assumption, and recklessness can have serious consequences, but that calm authority, discipline, and clarity can prevent harm and ensure justice. The Army officer's actions became a lasting example of courage and professionalism, and the officer who had caused the incident faced consequences that reflected the seriousness of his actions. Through the investigation, public attention, and professional review, the story of that day in the supermarket served as a clear reminder that accountability matters, that professionalism is essential, and that calm, disciplined leadership can make a real difference in dangerous situations. The Army officer's presence, guidance, and composure turned a potentially tragic moment into a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of the store, leaving a lasting impact on everyone involved. Months had passed since the incident in the supermarket, but the memory of that day lingered for everyone involved. The officer who had drawn his weapon no longer had the authority or the uniform that once defined him. The formal investigation had concluded, and the decision to remove him from duty had been finalized. It was a heavy consequence, one that reflected the seriousness of his actions and the responsibility he had failed to uphold. The weight of public scrutiny, professional review, and personal reflection had left him changed. The Army officer, meanwhile, continued her daily work with the same discipline and composure she had displayed during the incident. Yet the experience had left an imprint on her as well. She understood more than ever the fragile line between authority and aggression, and how a single moment of poor judgment could escalate into a dangerous situation. She had faced fear and potential harm calmly and professionally, but she knew that not every encounter would be so visible, so recorded, or so resolvable without incident. For the officer who had lost his job, life became a period of reckoning. Without his uniform and role, he confronted the reality of his choices. The recognition that his career had ended because of one reckless act forced him to reflect deeply. He thought about his assumptions, his biases, and the decisions that led him to point a weapon unnecessarily. These reflections were uncomfortable, even painful, but they were necessary for understanding how far he had strayed from responsibility and professionalism. He spent hours revisiting the recordings and witness statements, seeing himself from the perspective of others. The Army officer's calm authority was stark against his impulsive, fear-driven behavior. He noticed the way she had guided him without anger, how she had controlled the situation without force, and how she had maintained safety for everyone in the aisle. He realized that real strength was not aggression. It was composure, discipline, and the ability to take control of a situation responsibly. His personal life was also affected. Friends and family who had known him as a law enforcement officer struggled to reconcile his actions with the person they had trusted. Conversations that once centered on career achievements now focused on accountability, mistakes, and the consequences of unchecked behavior. He began to understand that leadership and authority are inseparable from responsibility, and that public trust is earned through consistent professionalism, not assumption or bias. Meanwhile, the department implemented new training and awareness programs inspired by the incident. Officers were reminded of the importance of bias awareness, de-escalation techniques, and the responsible use of authority. The Army officer's calm, professional handling of the supermarket confrontation became part of these lessons. Her actions were studied not as a critique of the officer who had failed, but as an example of how composure, discipline, and clear judgment can prevent dangerous escalation. For the community, the incident remained a touchstone. Local organizations, schools, and civic groups discussed it as a case study in responsibility, professionalism, and human behavior. It became a story not only about misconduct but also about courage, accountability, and the difference that a calm and disciplined individual can make in a tense situation. Many praised the Army officer publicly, recognizing the courage it takes to maintain calm and authority under pressure. The former officer faced a long road toward rebuilding his life. The removal from duty was permanent, and his reputation in law enforcement circles was tarnished. Opportunities he had previously taken for granted were no longer available. Yet this consequence also offered a chance for reflection and growth. He began to understand that true accountability requires accepting responsibility fully, learning from mistakes, and striving to become a better person. He sought guidance from mentors outside of law enforcement, people who emphasized ethics, accountability, and leadership. These conversations were difficult but necessary. He reflected on how bias, unchecked assumptions, and impulsive actions had nearly caused irreparable harm. He came to see that authority carries not only power but immense responsibility, and that every action, no matter how small it seems in the moment, has consequences. The Army officer, for her part, continued to serve with distinction. She carried herself with the same discipline and composure that had defined the supermarket incident, but she also became more aware of the influence she held. Her example reminded others that true leadership is exercised through clarity, calm, and professionalism. Colleagues sought her guidance on de-escalation and accountability, and she shared her experience to help prevent similar incidents. Community engagement became part of her work. She spoke at events and programs about professionalism, bias awareness, and calm leadership. She used the supermarket incident as an example of what can happen when authority is misused, and how proper training and composure can prevent harm. Her story resonated deeply because it was real, human, and relatable. It highlighted the lessons that emerged not just from policy or theory, but from lived experience. For the former officer, facing the consequences gradually became a form of personal growth. He enrolled in courses and seminars focused on ethical decision-making, leadership, and communication. Each session forced him to confront the behaviors and assumptions that had led to his downfall. Over time, he began to recognize patterns of thought and reaction that had been harmful, not just to others but to himself. He saw that his career had ended because he had failed to exercise the judgment and discipline expected of someone in his role. In private moments, he thought often about the Army officer. He realized that her calm, professional approach had saved him from a situation that could have been far worse, potentially deadly. She had not only prevented harm, but had also given him an example of how authority could be exercised responsibly. Her courage and composure were humbling, and he began to understand the true meaning of professionalism and accountability. As time passed, the lessons of the incident continued to ripple outward. Training programs, departmental protocols, and community awareness campaigns referenced the event as a case study in responsibility and de-escalation. The Army officer's handling of the situation became a model for others, demonstrating that fear, aggression, or bias are never effective substitutes for calm judgment and professionalism. Her actions were cited not just as heroic but as instructive, showing how ordinary circumstances can reveal extraordinary character. The former officer, though removed from his position, gradually learned to apply the lessons he had been forced to confront. He became more reflective, more aware of the consequences of actions, and more committed to fairness in judgment and behavior. The supermarket incident remained a defining moment in his life, a reminder of the cost of impulsive, biased decisions, and the importance of accountability in every sphere of life. Meanwhile, the Army officer continued to excel in her career. Her experience in the supermarket incident had strengthened her reputation for calm leadership, ethical decision-making, and professionalism under pressure. Colleagues, superiors, and the community at large recognized her as someone who could handle crises without fear, without bias, and with clear judgment. Her example inspired others to reflect on their own behavior and the impact of their actions. The story of the incident became a lasting lesson in accountability, composure, and responsibility. It demonstrated how moments of recklessness can have wide-reaching consequences, and how courage and professionalism can prevent harm and teach invaluable lessons. The supermarket aisle, once an ordinary space, had become a stage for a human story of error, accountability, and integrity. In the end, the incident left a legacy of learning. The Army officer's actions reminded everyone that authority is not simply a title or a uniform. It is a responsibility to act with clarity, fairness, and calm judgment. The former officer's consequences highlighted the cost of impulsive, biased decisions and the importance of reflecting on one's actions. The story served as a reminder that accountability is not punishment alone, but a chance to learn, grow, and understand the value of ethical behavior. The supermarket incident would be remembered by witnesses, the community, and those involved as a turning point. It was a moment that revealed human strengths and weaknesses, demonstrating both the dangers of unchecked authority and the power of calm, disciplined leadership. The Army officer's composure prevented harm, ensured accountability, and left a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed her courage and professionalism. Ultimately, the lessons endured far beyond the immediate events. The former officer faced consequences, reflection, and personal growth, while the Army officer's example inspired others to uphold the highest standards of professionalism, calm, and ethical responsibility. The story became a testament to the impact one person can have through composure, discipline, and clear judgment, and a reminder that the choices we make, even in ordinary moments, can have extraordinary consequences. The supermarket, once a place of routine shopping, had become the site of a story about human behavior, responsibility, and ethical decision-making. It was a story about mistakes, accountability, and the power of composure. It reminded people that authority carries responsibility, that recklessness has consequences, and that calm, professional behavior can turn a